In the true spirit of Valentine's Day, I have dug through my extensive Warhammer collection to unearth my favorite couple, Vargard Oberon and Nemesor Zandrik of the Necrons, who I am very happy I purchased quite a few years ago because these guys are now discontinued and no longer a part of the Necron Codex. But I think that's a real shame because in my opinion, these two characters best exemplify the true cosmic horror that is the Necron lore. And speaking of horror, these guys are Finecast, so this is gonna take some work. Finecast was an invention of Games Workshop in 2011 when they moved all their metal models into resin, which should have been a great move. Lighter, easier to work with resin, but somehow the company that makes the best plastic minis by a mile makes the worst resin. Their resin is soft, brittle, and full of flaws. Gates right over important details that are nearly impossible to remove, bendy, warpy weapons, and weird rough spots are everywhere. When most smaller companies are producing utterly flawless resin, Games Workshop is still making stuff like this. Although it is getting phased out, with only a handful of minis still sold in Finecast today. Step 1 working with any resin is washing. I put the parts into my ultra cheap ultrasonic cleaner with 50% soap, 50% water, and after a good shaken, I rinsed off the parts, and then came the process of finding and fixing every imperfection. It's really hard to tell sometimes if a part is a detail or a resin gate, like this little triangle on his butt. I'm gonna cut it off, but it could just be a proper Necron butt. And it took a lot of sanding to get them somewhat smooth. And then came unwarping them. The best way to soften resin is to dunk them in hot water. This gets them loosey-goosey, and if I just hold them in the appropriate way, they will cool down and stay that way. The staffs were almost impossible to get right. I glued on Oberon's hands and then little by little straightened his stick, dipping it into the hot water and trying to eyeball the angle. Xander's staff is just a long piece of resin. It looks pretty good, but if I ever drop him, that staff is snapping right off. These two lovebirds are looking sharp, just a little more cleanup, fixing any holes, bubbles, and dents with plastic putty. In the world of Warhammer 40k, it's very unusual for characters to be linked. Usually every character in 40k is a singular, stoic badass. But Xander and Oberon are a pair. And I love the way that works with the Necron lore, because it really stinks to be a Necron. And the Necrons are not what they appear. They're not alien robots. They're aliens who unfortunately are now robots. The world of Warhammer 40k is a bunch of different factions and species fighting for dominance of the galaxy, but the Necrons lost that fight 65 million years ago during biotransference, when the living essence of the Necrotire were placed in the soulless, unfeeling, unchanging bodies of the Necrons. And that's why I love to ship these two. Not just because it's cute and adorable and I love it, because there's other things like that. There's Guilliman and Yvraine, or Grey Fox and Celestine, where it's just kind of a meme. But if these two were romantically linked, and I mean romantic in both senses of the word, like dictionary definition, romantic, bullet point number 1, candlelit dinner, long walks on the beach, but bullet point number 2, an imaginative and idealized idea. If these two love each other, it makes the story so much sadder. But right now, it's time to base these guys. Since these guys are discontinued, I need to make some decisions on how to run them in modern 40k. Xander is obviously a lord, so I'll give him a 40mm base, but Oberon is very unique. He's Vargard, which is really just a Lich Guard. I'm gonna put him on a 32mm base and count him as a Royal Warden. Not a perfect fit, but I'll get to use him in more games. I need to build up the height of these characters to match them to their modern counterparts. And over the years, I have perfected the Cork Tower. I glued down my first layer of 1/4 inch cork and then laid down a second on top, breaking the boundaries of the base. To mark where his feet sit, I put a little paint on his feet and stuck them down, leaving me perfect marks. The stick-out shape of the cork protects his fragile cloak from bumping into other models, and I sanded a slight angle on the cork. Then I ripped up the excess cork, leaving behind a nice boulder for him to perch on. I did the same thing on Oberon, and to fill in the ground, I took some milliput and made a pile smoothing the transition from cork to base, and then covered it in wood glue and sprinkled on some small pebbles and sand. On every Necron character base, I glued down a little scarab swarm. For Xander, a modern one, and for Oberon, a retro one. Now that the pair are built, I primed them black and then zenithal them with white. So who are Nemesor Zandrik and Vargard Oberon? Well, in my opinion, they are the greatest Necron characters ever penned by Games Workshop, and it really boils my blood that they are currently deleted from the Necron range. But Nemesis Zandrik is probably the greatest strategic mind that has ever graced Warhammer 40,000. But he exemplifies the madness of the Necrons in that he doesn't see the world for what it is. And that might be on purpose. When Zandrik marches to war, he doesn't see humans and orcs and Eldar on the other side. He sees Necrotire. He's trapped in the heyday of him and Oberon fighting in the Necron Civil Wars. It's hinted at in the lore that it is because of the Great Sleep, the 65 million year slumber of the Necrons after the War in Heaven, but I tend to think it's on purpose, that Zandrik can't handle the horror and the sadness that has befallen the Necrons. After biotransference, they have the very worst form of immortality. Unfeeling, unchanging, unending Necron bodies. I think for him, it's better to believe that he's still in the past when things were good, and when he and his buddy ruled the Sautekh dynasty as BFFs forever. Still a better love story than Twilight. And speaking of his BFF forever, Oberon is his protector, and Oberon sees the world for what it is. He sees the sadness and the worthlessness of the Necron dynasties at this point. But he's decided not to leave, not to give up, but just to kind of play in to the pretend game that is the Necrons currently. They can't win. They can't reclaim their mortality. They can't even feel emotions. And so he's devoted his eternity to defending his buddy, Zandrik. No blow, no wound, nothing will ever befall Zandrik because Vargard Oberon is his protector. And I have a very difficult decision to make. These guys are part of the Sautekh dynasty. They have specific colors, but I want to put them into my Necron army with my custom white and orange color scheme. So I have to decide, do I paint them correctly or do I make them fit my army? And I think Games Workshop has made that decision very easy because if these guys are no longer sort of, kind of officially part of the Necron lore, I think I have a lot of room to fudge the paint job a little bit. And probably, since Necron are essentially super wizards, they can probably change their armor color with just a thought. My Necron color scheme is as simple as they come. I thinned down Nuln Oil 50-50 and gave each partner a dunking. And while they were drying, I picked out their weapons, robes, and scarves with some Black Templar contrast paint. I painted bronze over their decorations, and usually my Necrons would be pretty much done now. The modern perfect plastic Necrons take a wash like a dream, but these old Finecast minis have a lot of texture that holds too much wash. And it highlights the imperfections. So I used white paint to highlight the armor, making about 100 layers of glazes to make them look much more perfect and clean than they really are. But you know it's always perfect and clean, that's right, our Patreon. We have monthly terrain packs. This month it's the Ruined Temple, a modular network of stones and walls that can be assembled into all manner of mysterious and ancient ruins. And if you always want to be up to date on the goings-on at Eons of Battle and be entered into our monthly giveaways, this month we're giving away a copy of Age of Sigmar's Dominion and picking 3 followers to receive this month's terrain. Follow the link in the description to sign up to our newsletter. I put a brown wash over the bronze armor and highlighted with a silver paint and a gold paint. I don't often use true metallic metals, but on something as simple as these Necrons, I think it looks really good. Now for my favorite part of my Necrons, the lava energy weapons. I started by base coating the blades with a dark red and then highlighting up to pure red, picking about 50% of the blade to highlight. My transition from dark red to red isn't particularly smooth, but I find it easier to just keep going and fix it later. I threw a yellow onto my palette and mixed up a red orange and kept layering following my red highlights. And then they did the same thing with orange, and then pure yellow. After it was all done, I was pretty happy with it. Only a few spots I decided to fix, glazing a bit more of the original red and adding some highlights onto the tail blade. I like to just get through a detail like this and then correct the spots I'm not satisfied by. If I try to get everything perfect and smooth in the moment, I just drive myself crazy. I dripped some white ink into the Necron glyphs and these power weapons were complete. Now for their clothing, which is Necron chainmail. I edge highlighted each brick with red and then did another edge highlight with yellow. This was pretty time consuming, but I love the look it gives. It adds a ton of warmth, which makes their white armor stand out even more. Xander has a full cape of the stuff. Oberon wears the exact same pattern as 2 small scarves. I threw some gray highlights onto their weapon handles and then picked out their nearly microscopic eyes with red paint. One detail I find very interesting and lends a little bit more credibility to my idea that there was a little more going on between Xander and Oberon than just king and bodyguard is that Necron nobility, when they went through biotransference, they all received much better quality Necron armor and very unique Necron armor. No two lords or overlords look the same, even the cryptex look wildly different from one another. But Xander and Oberon have identical armor. Xander is a Necron overlord, but Oberon is just essentially a Lich Guard, like a normal Lich Guard. He doesn't have a proper place in the Necron royal court, and yet his armor is identical to an overlord's. I think that this is a subtle way of connecting these two guys together, and I find it very interesting. And speaking of interesting, it is time for the bases. And I don't know the color scheme of my Necron bases. I've painted a heck of a lot of them, but I've never written it down, so just gonna have to figure that out. This is my favorite Necron base I've done, and I think I see a tan color with some kind of a yellow, and I'm pretty sure the red stuff is pigment powder. It's been a while. I poured myself a little bit of light yellow, thinned it down, and then slobbered this over the bases. I thinned it down a lot. I don't really need the color, I just need it to tint the primer. Then I mixed up a slurry of red oxide pigment powder. I made a pretty thick solution so it looks like it covers the yellow 100%, but it all comes down to the magic trick. Once I had a fully saturated base, I squirted water over it. This thins down the pigment and washes it away from the highest points and forces it to settle into the lowest spots on the base. Pigments look very different wet versus dry, so I let the bases dry and then looked them over. Using a damp brush, I changed up some of the spots I wasn't happy with, and then once I had the look I wanted, I airbrushed Indian yellow, an ultra saturated yellow color over top of everything, which gave the bases a super hot red yellow look, which makes their cold white bodies pop incredibly bright on top of them. One last little trick for my Necrons is I paint the base rim gray. This looks good against the orange color of the base and doesn't pull any focus from the black on their bodies. The Necrons are one of the most interesting and unique factions in 40k. They represent the misery that the other factions are heading towards. Immortality as a curse. Necrons are doomed to exist eternally as they are. There's no dream of a better future or prayers to powerful gods. And if one day the Necrons successfully reconquered the galaxy and planted their flag, what would that mean? What would be the difference between a barren collection of rocks orbiting a black hole and a galaxy of Necrons? Xandric and Oberon ask the question, what do you do when faced with this version of immortality? And they choose to play pretend. Endlessly campaigning, trying to relive a time when they still had souls and could still feel and were still themselves. It's a scary, lonely idea. Two beings, Xandric and Oberon, just riding out infinity together. It's sort of a lovely and haunting story, and that's why it's my favorite in 40k. Thanks for watching.